Yates got the idea to kill her children because she had recently watched an episode of Law and Order SVU that dealt with the same issue, drowning children in a bathtub, when in reality, that episode doesn't exist. So the jury found this out as they were deliberating and decided to find her guilty but not give her the death penalty. Eventually, there was a retrial because of this misinformation, and July 2006, she was found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to the North Texas State Hospital, which is a high-security mental health facility, where she received medical treatment and was a roommate of Dina Schlosser, who was another woman who had committed infanticide by killing her infant daughter. In January 2007, she was moved to a different low-security state mental hospital in Caraville, Texas. Yates had suffered from depression since she was a teenager. But after having her fourth child, Luke, she started to fall into a depression again. And between June 1999 and May 3rd, 2001, she had attempted suicide multiple times, had been hospitalized multiple times, and had been put on medication, which seemed to be really working for her until she stopped taking it. So the psychiatrist that she was working with originally told her not to have any more children, but shortly after that, they conceived their fifth child. So when she became pregnant, she stopped taking her medication. She had her fifth child, and she ended up having a mental breakdown, going into basically a catatonic state, and ended up killing her children. So she was diagnosed with postpartum psychosis, but I wanted to talk a little bit about postpartum. So, according to the MGH Center for Women's Mental Health, the postpartum period is described or characterized as a rapid shift of hormones in the body. So estrogen and progesterone concentrations fall dramatically during this time. And because these hormones can work to regulate mood, they have a role in postpartum affective illnesses like depression and psychosis. The site describes 3 mood shifts and disorders that can happen after birth, which are postpartum blues, which happen to up to 85% of new mothers, postpartum depression, and postpartum psychosis. So like I said, the postpartum blues are very normal and can last up to 2 weeks in new mothers. The symptoms usually peak on the 4th or 5th day, which in these symptoms are like tearfulness, crying a lot, anxiety, and irritability, and usually they go away after a couple weeks. Postpartum depression usually emerges over the first 2 or 3 months of a new motherhood, and sometimes can present actually during pregnancy. signs are restlessness, irritability, and insomnia. Women with this disorder exhibit a rapidly shifting, depressed, or elevated mood, disorientation, or confusion, and erratic or disorganized behavior. Delusional beliefs are common and often center on the infant. Auditory hallucinations that instruct the mother to harm herself or her infant also may occur. Risk for infanticide as well as suicide is significant in this population. All women are vulnerable to postpartum depression, regardless of age, marital status, education level, or socioeconomic status. Sorry, I'm mixing up my words today. While it is impossible to predict who will develop postpartum depression, certain risk factors for PPD have been identified, including a previous episode of postpartum depression, depression during pregnancy, a history of depression or bipolar disorder, recent stressful life events, inadequate social support, and marital problems. So, one of my favorite true crime reporters or investigative reporters wrote an article in the Texas Monthly, and I wanted to read it to you guys, so I'm going to pull it up here on my iPad. The reporter's name is Skip Hollingsworth, and he is the reporter who also did the podcast Tom Brown's Body, which some of you might remember me talking about or have listened to yourself. So the title of the article is called Her Dark Places. I might not be able to get to the entire thing today, depending on how noisy things get upstairs. My roommate slash my brother and his wife are off from school now, so they're going to be around for the next month, so it's going to be a little bit more difficult for me to find time to record. So keep that in mind. Alright, so the article is called Her Dark Places. Up until the moment Andrea Yates murdered her 5 children, she could have been any mother in America, setting aside her own wants and needs for her loved ones, which is why, in addition to being horrified, so many of us are sympathetic. She was such a familiar woman, a quiet, thoughtful, suburban mother with dark brown eyes and a generous smile on her good days. She was a devout Christian who read Bible stories to her 5 children. She constructed Indian costumes for them from grocery sacks. She gave them homemade valentines on Valentine's Day with personalized coupons, promising them free hugs and other treats. She was so protective of her brood that on trips to the grocery store, she had each of her 4 boys hold onto a corner of the grocery cart while her infant daughter sat in a car seat in the basket. On June 20th, she decided she had had enough. Andrea Yates, 36 years old, called the police and asked them to come to the family's one-story Spanish-style house in Clear Lake, southeast of Houston. She led the officers past the plaque in the living room that read, "Blessed are the children," and took them to a back bedroom where 4 of the 8 children lay shoulder to shoulder, their eyes wide open. In a calm 7-year-old Noah, but she brought him back to the tub. Why? The police detective asked her. Why? She stared off into the distance. She was a bad mother, she said, and she felt that the children were disabled and not developing normally. And so she decided to send them to God. She gave each of her children a baptism, then laid them out on the bed, except for Noah, who was left in the bathtub, like a perfect little Christian saint. And that, in 3 short paragraphs, sums up one of the most sickening and yet mesmerizing murder stories in modern Texas history. Even now, more than a month since the drownings, people cannot stop talking about Andrea Yates. The attempt to answer the question of why she did it has become a small industry in the country. So far, her deed has been blamed on her postpartum depression after the birth of her 5th child, her fundamentalist religious beliefs, her doctors, her husband, who supposedly didn't do enough for her, her extended family, who could have helped her more during the times of stress, and her stubborn neighbors, who apparently were too consumed with their lives to notice what was going on in hers. What's just as astonishing is the way Andrea Yates has triggered feelings of sympathy. The most striking event that took place in the immediate aftermath of the murders was not the impromptu press conference held by Andrea's husband, Russell, and the 36-year-old NASA computer scientist who appeared to be completely in shock as he held a photo of his family and spoke in a dazed voice about his family being normal. It was the mothers, some of whom brought their children, who came to Yates's home to stand behind the police tape. Occasionally they darted underneath the tape to leave stuffed animals, bouquets, potted plants, poems, and letters beside a tree. One unsigned letter to Russell Yates began, "I'm a stay-at-home mother of 3. I also suffer from depression and I take medicine. I pray for strength for you and your wife and family. It's a day-to-day struggle for me and my husband and family." One woman told reporters that she too had suffered from postpartum depression after her son was born. "Thankfully I got help," she said. "I never got to the point of killing him, but I know how it is." She basically lost herself. Just 7 weeks before the drownings, there had been another horrific case of a parent murdering a child in Texas. A well-heeled Dallas accountant named John Battaglia was arrested for shooting his 2 young daughters to death, while the mother, his ex-wife, listened over the telephone. He too had an emotional disorder, yet he was quickly dismissed by almost everyone. People thought that he was deranged and abusive and should be sent off to death row as quickly as possible. Men who go mad do not interest us, but women who go mad are haunting, and when it came to Andrea Yates, the only person I could find in Houston who wanted her to go to death row was Diane Clements, the president of a Houston victims' rights group called Justice for All, and who said she was disturbed by the way Yates' family and neighbors kept talking about what a lovely woman she was. Also, I should say that this article was written in 2001. So I believe before the retrial, he wrote this while she was on trial or about to be on trial. There's no denying that she was a lovely woman. Andrea Yates was not like Susan Smith, the young Union, South Carolina mother who sent her car into a lake with her 2 sons locked inside because she had become involved in an adulterous affair with a man she thought would marry her only if her children were gone. Yates came with no baggage. She was the kind of young She was the most compassionate of my children, always thinking of people, never of herself. And that is perhaps what struck a chord in so many women. Here was someone like themselves, alone in a house with her children, often at wit's end, yet continuing to deny her own needs to tend to her children, and a husband who believed in traditional family lifestyle. And the former high school football star, Russell Yates, according to news media accounts, was the definition of a straight-laced Christian traditionalist. He didn't want his wife working outside the home. He didn't want her to use babysitters because they might teach the children too many worldly attitudes. And he wanted the children homeschooled so that they would be kept away from temptations of drugs, violence, sex, and unchristian ideals. What's more, Yates did exactly what so many other women do every day. She never let people around the community and neighborhood see what was happening inside of her. 2 weeks before the drowning, she went to a barbecue at her brother's house, and according to one person who had been there, she was rambunctious and happy. Several days later, she showed up with her children at the Houston bookstore, where she brought supplies to homeschool the other boys. Co-owner Terry Arnold, as usual, commented on how slim and attractive she looked. Andrea was not the stereotypical homeschool mom in long denim dresses, said Arnold. She wore t-shirts and blue jeans, and she could really look very attractive when she pulled her hair back in a long French braid. After noticing the children playing quietly in a corner of the store, the other co-owner, Joanne Jurin, told Yates, "If we had a gold star to give to the best children, we would give it to yours." Yates beamed and asked about enrolling her eldest Noah in a science class starting that fall. This was not a crazy woman, says Arnold. Yet, according to what Yates later told police, she was already planning at that time to kill her children. She said she had been thinking about killing them for months. You would have thought she would go down in history as the modern-day Medea. But within 48 hours of the murders, Yates had become a symbol of the precarious nature of American motherhood to a host of journalists, academics, and psychiatrists. The night after the killings, Nightline gathered a group of experts to talk about Yates and the potential dangers of postpartum depression in young mothers. Newsweek put together a cover story on Yates with a headline that read, "Motherhood and Murder." As a part of the magazine's package of stories, columnist Anna Quindlen wrote, "Every mother I've asked about the Yates case has the same reaction. She's appalled, she's aghast, and then she gets this look, and the look says, at some forbidden level, that she understands." No one was quoted more in the aftermath of the drownings than Michelle Oberman, a professor at DePaul University College of Law, and the co-author of Mothers Who Killed Their Children, which was recently released, not by some cheesy paperback true crime publisher, but by the esteemed New York University Press. Citing research into a decade's worth of child murders at the hands of mothers, there are some 200 such murders a year in the United States. Oberman told me that a murderous mother is often a reflection of the society in which the murder occurs. There are women with serious disorders who cannot parent their children the way social norms dictate, so they begin to feel more and more desperate. Meanwhile, a new generation of psychiatrists was leaping into the Yates media fray to state that the medical establishment was still not grasping the significance of emotional anxieties in new mothers. They pointed out that some 80% of new mothers reportedly experience some form of depression, She said she was amazed by how many women she meets who suffer from this kind of depression, which has never been properly diagnosed. When I asked per year how quickly postpartum depression, which is characterized by withdrawal, despondency, and fatigue, could lead to postpartum psychosis, she replied that such an event would be extremely rare, but if it did happen, she said, it could happen in the space of a week or two. All this talk in the news media set off something of minor panic, at least in Houston. Within a week after the drownings, 4 women called Child Protective Services and asked that someone come get their children because they were suffering from postpartum depression and were not sure what they might do. It was an interesting response, considering that no one was sure what level of postpartum depression Yates had endured and what the long-term mental repercussions had been. The only information about her postpartum problems has come from her brothers and her husband. The doctors who have treated her remain tight-lipped. In fact, no one had any real idea when Yates' mental illness began. One longtime friend said she had displayed minor depression back in high school, and no one was sure what caused it to escalate. One of her brothers even said he noticed changes in Yates' demeanor even before she began having children in 1994. The slide continued with a miscarriage between the births of her 3rd and 4th children. Little by little she withdrew. Her first suicide attempt, she took an overdose of her father's Alzheimer's medication, came in June 1999, 4 months after the birth of her 4th child. Back then, a neighbor would later say, she seemed to be struggling, trying to care for her father and her children at the same time. But if that was the source of her stress, Yates never talked about it. She had become so private, one of her brothers later said, that she wouldn't tell anyone what led to her attempted suicide. After hospitalizations and intensive drug treatments, there were times when her condition seemed to improve. Her husband said that at one point she completely snapped out of it, quote unquote, after a regimen of antidepressants and Haldol, a powerful drug used to treat delusions, schizophrenia, and mania. But after her father's death this past spring, in a bedroom at her mother's house, she held a knife against her throat and threatened to kill herself. She was hospitalized again. When she was released, Russell's mother came each day to help her care for the children. One day she saw Andrea in one of the rooms, straightening it to make room for the baby's crib. She decided that Andrea must be feeling better, but the next morning, 1 hour before her mother-in-law was scheduled to arrive, Andrea and the children kissed her husband goodbye as he left for work. Then she took the children inside to drown them. Today, what's left is a lot of finger-pointing, and much of it is directed at Russell Yates. Am I the only person wondering exactly what Russell Yates was thinking every morning when he left his house and went off to work, leaving his 5 children at home alone with a mother who was so depressed that in 1999 she tried to kill herself? Said Jan Jarbo. Russell, in her San Antonio Express News column, Andrea's brothers and sister have told the press that Russell did not give his wife a break from the stress. They say she never had time away from the kids, and that there was no reason for him to try for a 5th child after the depression Andrea had experienced from the birth of their 4th. Did Russell spend more time trying to hide his wife's illness than trying to fix it? His friends insist that he was doing everything he could to help Andrea get well, taking her to a variety of hospitals and doctors, keeping track of her prescriptions on a board at home, and even inventing little games with his children that they hoped would coax her out of her dark mood. He didn't see what was coming, says friend Rick Mayfield. Do you really think that if he thought his wife was going to kill his children, he would have gone to work? It could well be that none of this would have happened if Andrea had remained on the antipsychotic drug Haldol. According to Russell, she was taken off the medication 2 weeks before the children's death. But who knows if that would have saved her? Who knows what might have happened if she had spent more time away from the kids, if she had not led such an isolated life? The Yates didn't even attend church, or if more of her neighbors had taken the time to talk to her. Andrea herself certainly isn't offering any insight. When her brother and sister visited her recently in jail, she stared blankly at a wall, her long hair askew and her arms tightly folded. She didn't seem to know what had happened to her children, but at one point she did ask if a funeral had occurred. They told her it had. It had been a beautiful funeral, in fact. Russell himself had delivered the eulogy, speaking for nearly an hour about his kids. At the end, he approached each of the children's small white caskets and tucked their baby blankets over their bodies. Then, just before he left each child, he bid them farewell. To Noah, he said, "You're in a better place." It was an odd comment to make, for that was exactly what had driven his wife to murder the children. She, too, had wanted them to be in a better place. Okay, so that is the end of the article in Texas Monthly by Skip Allensworth called Her Dark Places, written in August 2001. This was a really tough case for me to revisit and look into. Depression is a difficult topic. Suicide is a difficult topic. And when it results